All of us have seen Egyptian hieroglyphs. We've seen them in movies, we've seen them in books, we've seen them in museums. But what do they mean? How do they record human language? We're going to try to answer that question for you in this presentation, but it's important to remember that for over 1,500 years, knowledge of the Egyptian language was lost. People could go to Egypt and surrounding areas and they could see images carved into stone. They could see pictures and symbols, and many of them they could recognize very easily. They could see a bird, they could see an arm, a foot, a leg. But the question was, what do these things mean? We look at this picture. Who is that person in that chair? The truth is, his name is written all over the place. The problem was that we were unable to read them, as I say, for over 1,500 years. Ancient Egypt goes back a really, really long way. If we look at some of the first pieces of Egyptian culture, we're going back many, many thousands of years, long before the Egyptians learned how to write down their language. But we can see something distinctive in it. We could see an Egyptian quality. If we go back to the Naqada I period, as it is referred to, this goes back to 4400 BC. This is over 6,000 years ago. These are examples of pots that miraculously are preserved from that period, and we can see a kind of elegance in it, a kind of artistic sensibility. If we move forward to the Naqada II period, we can see examples of Egyptian painting in the pottery. You can notice this little figurine here. Look at the arrangement of the arms. And then over here we can see the same thing. Who was that? Well, we have no way of knowing because from this period we have no written language. But we can begin to speculate by looking at things in a later period. This is from the Naqada III period, which is the 31st century BC, and this is one of the earliest pieces of art that we can really see and identify without any question as being Egyptian. We can see many cultural elements that remain consistent throughout all of the dynasties of ancient Egypt. We can see the crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. Let's take a closer look. If we notice here in this image, which is called a serek, this little box here is called serek, inside we see a catfish, and then underneath the catfish we see a chisel. The word catfish is nar, and the word for chisel is mer. And so we believe that this is the name of this particular king, Narmer. This method of writing language or recording sound or recording ideas is called rebus or rebus, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. We have other evidence of this. For example, this weapon that he's holding is called a mace, and on top of it is a very large, heavy stone weight, which, miraculously, we have. Here it is. This is the Narmer mace head, and you could see on it this image of a cow and its calf. And then also, right here, we can see the serek. We can see the catfish, the chisel, and on top of it is a bird. And this bird is representing the god Horus, who will be very important later on in the religion of ancient Egypt. Now let's discuss the development of writing with Egyptian characteristics. The first step in the process of development of writing for many cultures, including Egypt, was pictographs. Picture writing. We still use pictures today to express certain ideas. If you go to an airport or to a bus stop, you'll see them everywhere. We see images like these all the time. It's very interesting that no matter what culture you happen to come from, if you come from the same type of developmental culture, if you have a culture that doesn't have any cars, then obviously you're not going to recognize the car. But if you come from the same type of technological background, no matter what language you happen to speak, you can understand the pictures. We can see that this is a taxi, that this is luggage, that this wants us to go that way. This is an airplane. This is a man. This is a woman. This is a restroom. Man and woman, male and female restrooms. We have a public bus, a helicopter, stairs going down, or perhaps an escalator going down. But we can't really read pictographs. We look at them, we know the meaning, but we don't actually read them like a regular written language. So the gap between the pictograph and the representation of language itself begins with what is called the rebus, or this is actually a Latin word, rebus, and rebus means with things. This means to write something down with things. Let's take a look at what could be done using the rebus. When we look at this, what do we see? Well, we see a bee. But how about this? What if I told you I was recording a sentence here, an entire sentence, using only these pictures? Some of you have probably guessed it. We have here 2 bees. We have another 2 bees. We have an or, and we have a not. Can you get it? Can you guess? To be or not to be. To be or not to be. That sort of phrase, just by sheer luck, turns out to be very easy to express using the rebus method, but if we were to try to say that is the question, it would be a lot more difficult to do. So when we see the name of Narmer, this of course is a rebus, but you notice that on that piece of art, the Narmer palette, nothing else was expressed in that way. And that's because it's very difficult to get complex ideas to come across using the rebus method. The next step in the process, though, is called the acronymic method, or using acronyms. So, for example, we'll do another rebus example. We have a bee, and we have a leaf, and so we have bee-leaf. Believe. That works perfectly well. But in the acronymic method, what we do is we take literally the word acro means high, the highest end, the highest part of the word. And for those words, that would be the first letter. The acronym is the first letter. So instead of saying B, we just have the letter B. Instead of having leaf, we just have L. And so if we add a few more to this, for example, a kite, k, and an or, o, then we can use these pictures to spell out words. For example, what do you think that is? I'm sure you guessed it. That's book, B-O-O-K. But of course, I'm getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here. The problem is that for whatever reason, ancient peoples didn't automatically realize that vowels like O, A, E, U were independent sounds. They linked them to consonants, and so as a result, they didn't make many, or actually they didn't make any symbols representing vowel sounds. So if we don't have vowels and we're left only with consonants, it becomes a little complicated to spell out things and be absolutely certain of what we're writing down. For example, if I were to have this and this, what do you think I'm trying to express? I might be saying black. I might be saying block. I might be saying bloke. Or I could be saying cab, cob, or cube. There's really no way to tell. So how do we make our meaning clear when we're using only the acronymic method? So the question is, how to clarify? How would I say book? How would I write that down and make it very clear? Or how about beak? What if I want to make that very clear? What should I do? The Egyptians found a way to clarify. They just spelled it out like usual, and then included something from a much older form of writing. They included a pictogram. So if I mean book, I have a picture of a book, and I have the sounds of that picture. And if I want to say beak, I have a beak, a picture of a beak, along with the sounds of beak. This element at the end that helps us to clarify the meaning is called a determiner. A determiner. Let's look at an Egyptian example. On this side, we have the sound, and over here we have the picture. What do you think that is? What do you think this is? Well, this is actually a mouth. This is an arm stretched out, and this is a picture of the sun. But we'll come to this example a little bit later. For right now, let's change this from an Egyptian example to an English one. What if I were to write this? What do you think that means? It could mean son, as in a male child. It could mean soon. It could mean seen. It could also mean this. Now you've got it. So now we understand that it is not son or soon or seen, but sun. And this is how Egyptian essentially worked. Now I want you to take a look at how beautiful Egyptian hieroglyphs are carved into this stone. Everything is proportional, everything is beautiful. But I want to show you another piece of Egyptian writing. This one. This one right here. What do you notice about it? Well, quite frankly, it's ugly. Let's compare it. Look at this. Now look at that. This inscription was written in the chapel of Mandalus on the island of Philae on 24th August in the year 394 AD. Now what makes this piece of Egyptian carving, this piece of Egyptian writing, special? It's certainly not its artistic value. I'd like to read something to you from a book called The Rosetta Stone by John Ray. In a corner of the island of Philae, on the wall of a chapel dedicated to the Nubian god Mandalus, there is an inscription, put there by a scribe of the sacred writings. A demotic graffito accompanying the text dates it to 24 August in the year AD 394. The hieroglyphs are crude compared with most of the texts from the site, and a romantically inclined visitor can imagine that they had been carved when the light was fading. We will never know the time of day when these hieroglyphs were written, but we do not need to know. The light that was fading when this text was composed was the light of knowledge. These are the last hieroglyphs that were carved in Egypt. Christianity had come to the Roman Empire, and the old gods were falling silent. And silent they remained for 1,500 years, actually a bit more than that, until one day in the year 1799, a stone was found in a place the French referred to as Rosetta. This is what the stone looks like today in the British Museum, and this is what the stone looked like when it was found by the French in 1799. This is a reconstruction of what the stone would have looked like originally. You can see that there are three very clear sections on this stone. None of them are complete. This one is the most complete, and this one is very special indeed because it is the only one of the three sections that we can read. This section was written in Greek. And the Greek section says that all three sections say the same thing. When people found this, they thought that deciphering the language of the ancient Egyptians would be very quick and very easy. They were wrong. It took a very long time to be able to understand exactly what this language was and how it worked. There was a struggle between two nations to decipher the Rosetta Stone. The English had a very famous scientist named Thomas Young, who had a vast amount of resources at his disposal, and also he had the original stone. In France, their champion was a young man of very limited means named Jean-François Champollion, and he did not have access to the original stone. He only had access to rubbings. But we will find that these two men approached their topic from two very different directions. One produced surprising results very, very quickly, but then came to a standstill. The other moved from success to success, a linguistic approach instead of a mathematical approach. So the two approaches to decipherment were essentially linguistic and mathematical. Young was able to determine the single consonant list and the meaning of various hieroglyphs through Greek translation. Young, however, began running into insurmountable obstacles, which we'll talk about in just a minute. Champollion was able to take the single consonant list further and was able to theorize sounds for the hieroglyphs via Coptic, the most recent form of the Egyptian language. Because he took a linguistic approach, Champollion moved from victory to victory, and ultimately, very few people remember Thomas Young, but anyone who studies anything at all about Egyptology will certainly know Jean-François Champollion. Now let's take a closer look at that mathematical approach before we get into Champollion's linguistic approach. The idea was quite simple, really. We know that the Rosetta Stone is written in 3 languages. The basic idea of the mathematical approach is if we read the Greek text paying very close attention to repeated patterns, like for example, the names of important people, and knowing also that this text and this text and this text all say the same thing, then we should be able to notice the same number and form of repeated patterns here. And the same thing will be true here. So what happened is Thomas Young went through this text very carefully and counted up all of the times that the name Ptolemy, or the name of the Greek descended Pharaoh, he counted up the number of times that name occurred. He did the same thing looking carefully at this central text, and even though he couldn't read it, he could spot a recurrent pattern. And the same thing in this small section of hieroglyphics up here. And so what they were able to extract from the Rosetta Stone was this, the name Ptolemaios. In the Demotic, this pattern occurred with the same frequency and location as Ptolemaios. And in the hieroglyphic section, we also have in the same location, of course there's not enough text to get a good frequency, but in the same location as in the Greek and the Demotic, we find this. And so the supposition was that these 3 were the same. And so from that, they began to work out, or Thomas Young did, a set of characters that represent sounds for spelling out foreign names. Remember, Ptolemy was Greek, not Egyptian, so his name is being spelled out. Now, as more artifacts came in from Egypt, then there were more opportunities to find examples where there were hieroglyphs and Greek on the same inscription, so other names started coming out as well. Let's take a closer look, and a clearer look, at the name Ptolemaios. We can see here a more idealized form of his name. We can see that we have different symbols, and these represent the name Ptolemaios in Greek, or Ptolemy as we say in English. We have this rectangle, this sort of semicircle, this thing, whatever it is, a lion, these things, whatever they are, and that. When, once again, just like them, we can't really be sure what these things are. We know today, of course, or at least we conjecture today what they are, and a lot of people have accepted what these things are. But at the time, they were just marks on a page. And the question was, how does this relate to this? Well, as I said, other names were found as more artifacts came in. And one example of that is this. Now, this is a much more famous king than Ptolemy, Alexander, or as he is called in Greek, Alexandros. And we can see the arrangement of elements, and we see some begin to repeat, like, for example, the lion, and this crooked thing here, and that. And we begin to see, as I say, repetition. And here's another example, a very famous queen. And we see, once again, repeated patterns. And her name is Cleopatra, or Cleopatra, as we say in English. And basically what they did is, it's pretty simple. They lined all of these things up. And they lined up the Greek names that they believed they were based on. And so the idea was, if this first name is Ptolemaios, then perhaps this symbol is a P. Perhaps this symbol is a T. Now, since Ptolemaios and Cleopatra have similar letters, we could see, for example, if we believe this is P, Ptolemaios, then there should be somewhere near the center of the name Cleopatra this same symbol. If we go down to Cleopatra's name, we find right in the middle this symbol. So the similarities between the two names were highlighted, and then a very careful counting of how many symbols were there were also added. And the number of sounds and the number of symbols don't exactly mesh up, but they're pretty close. And so they began working away at this. They decided that this was a P, and this is also P, T, T, O, O, L. Very interesting that lion is an L, and an L there, and an L there, an S, and so on, until they had conjectured sounds for each one of these symbols, or at least all the ones that they could imagine. And sometimes the symbols didn't exactly line up in the same way, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. Would we be able to use that to figure out the name of someone, a foreign person, written on an Egyptian artifact? Well, here's one, and here's another one. Now, I'll help you out a little bit. The part of this cartouche, as it's called, these circular things around names, they're called cartouches. These things contain the name of the foreign person. We're going to focus only on that part that we can actually decipher, being the person's name, the foreign person's name, in these monoliteral symbols. And it's this part right here. So if we take a look, we start reading from here. What is that? We look at our list, we get a k sound. It's a k sound, says k, k. We look here, we have that there. This is an E, so we have k, ki. This symbol, it looks like this one right here. There's an S, so it's kees. This one, we look here, it is an R, so it's keeser, and then we have keesers. Who do you think that could be? Keesers. Now, it's a foreign name written in Egyptian hieroglyphs, and I'll give you a hint. In a play about him by Shakespeare, he said famously, "Et tu, Brute." I bet you've guessed it. This is the name Caesar in Greek. It is Caesar in Latin, but in English pronunciation, we say Caesar. Now, how about this one over here? We have this bowl thing. Look at it here. It is a K sound. We have the E again. We have the S again, but this time it's not this, but that. And then we have the lion with an L. And then we have, once again, this S. So this is Keesilus. Can you guess what that might be? Well, this is a bit of a trick I'm playing on you, because these are both the same. This is Caesar, this is Caesar. It's just sometimes these symbols represent different sounds, which of course makes it a little more difficult to read Egyptian, but that's the way it is. Now, these two are the same thing. Both of them recognize the name of Julius Caesar, Julius Caesar. Now these are the alphabets published by Champollion. This is his table of phonetic symbols. And this is the table of phonetic symbols that you would come across in modern textbooks teaching Middle Egyptian. Now, what if we were trying to decipher Chinese in this way? What if we had, at some point in the future, no one could read Chinese characters anymore, but because China was a very important place a long, long time ago, and their culture was integrated with many others, there were lots of bilingual texts. Some texts were Chinese and English put together, side-by-side translation. So we would be able to work out a great deal about Chinese in this way, but you will see that we can only go so far. So what if we were trying to decipher Chinese in the same way that Thomas Young was attempting to translate Egyptian? Let's say we have this, and this, and this, and this. And from a careful study of the English translation, we know that the first one represented Alexander. We know that the second one represents Ptolemy. The third one represents David. And the final one there represents Goofy. Now, if we look very carefully at the name Alexander, Ptolemy, David, and Goofy, and we look at the Chinese characters, we can notice some similarities. For example, Alexander. 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 4 syllables, 4 characters. Ptolemy. 3 syllables, 3 characters. David. 2 syllables, 2 characters. Goofy. 2 syllables, 2 characters. Now we might try to assign some of these syllables to the Chinese characters in an attempt to figure out how they sounded. So for example, Alexander could be distributed over these characters as Alexander. Now, if you happen to be a Chinese speaker, you will know that this is not A, but it does have an A sound in this character. This is not Lek, but there's an L at the beginning of it. Now this is pretty close. We have sun, and this is actually shan, so not too far. And then we have der. Well, we know that this has a D sound in it, but it is not der, but it's close. I mean, it's in the ballpark. When we look down here, we might think this is pta. It isn't, but once again, it's in the ballpark. Le, mi. Now, this is actually very close, but it's only lak. It just happens that way. David, we might think this is da and vid. Now, this turns out to be the character da, but it's only lak. There's no science to it. It just happened that way. And then Goofy, Gu-fi. This is Gao-fei, Gao-gu, but once again, it's in the ballpark. So we could make out some rough approximations of what the sounds might actually be, but we wouldn't make very much progress at all in terms of understanding the pronunciation of Chinese. But it's more important to note that even though we're able to roughly assign sounds to these various characters, we don't actually have the ability to use these characters to read anything in Chinese. So although we might approximate a few sounds of Chinese in this way, we would hardly be even one step closer to reading even a simple sentence in Chinese like this one. Even though we can now recognize half the characters in the sentence according to their sound, the symbols altogether mean absolutely nothing to us. Now, of course, we would be able to figure out a few things about the language too using this method. So for example, if we had a sentence like this one, and we knew that the translation was Alexander is a good person. Now we know from earlier experience that this part is Alexander. So we are left to assume that these last three characters means is a good person. But of course the question is, which one means which? We have another example, and this one has the name Alexander again. We have this character again. We have this character again, but these two are different. And the translation is, Alexander is a bad person. Well, now we've made a big step forward. We know that now that this one and this one must be good and bad. But we still don't know what these two are. I mean, this one could be person, this one could be is, this one could be is, and this one could be person. We just can't tell. So now we see another example. We recognize Alexander. We recognize this character. We're not really sure what it is. And here are two new ones. And we have the translation, Alexander is a king. And so now we know that this must be is, and this must be person, and these two must be king. But we have no idea how they work together to express the idea king. So we know once again that this is, person, good, bad, king. However, we wouldn't know how they were pronounced. So this is how far Thomas Young and his mathematical approach got him. Now the difference between Thomas Young, as I said before, and Champollion is that Champollion took this information, made the best use of it he could, but his focus and his approach was a linguistic one. He understood that the latest form of the Egyptian language spoken in Egypt was Coptic, and so he began studying Coptic. He learned Coptic and actually became a world-famous expert in Coptic before he even finished his decipherment of the Rosetta Stone. Let's take a look at what he was doing. But before we do, it's important to understand something about the stages of the Egyptian language. Archaic Egyptian is the Egyptian used before 2600 BC. Old Egyptian is between 2600 BC and 2100 BC. Now, Middle Egyptian, which we call Classical Egyptian, is the language of the Middle Kingdom, and that is from 2000 BC to 1650 BC. And then we have Late Egyptian, Demotic Egyptian, which was actually that piece of writing in the center of the Rosetta Stone. And then we have Coptic. And Coptic went all the way until the 17th century. So it only died a couple of centuries before the time of Champollion, and the language was still being used as a liturgical language in the Coptic Church. And so Champollion was able to learn it, as I say, and there was a tremendous amount of knowledge concerning the Egyptian language, even the older Egyptian language, preserved in Coptic, in some of the letters and some of the way that they spoke. And they knew it, and Champollion was willing to talk to them, to learn about their culture, and because he was able to exploit Coptic in the problem he faced, he was able to succeed where Thomas Young's method began to fail. For example, here is the Coptic alphabet. Now, Coptic took the alphabet from Greek, and if you know the Greek alphabet, you can see very easily this is alpha, beta, gamma, delta, epsilon, zeta, eta, theta, iota, kappa, and so on. And finally, you get all the way down here to omega, but then suddenly you have these extra symbols. Now, Champollion asked the Copts what these were, and they explained that these letters were there to represent sounds that did not exist in the Greek alphabet, but also he understood from them and from his own research that these letters, these specialized Coptic letters, they evolved from Egyptian hieroglyphs, which you can see here. So this was a great help to him in beginning to understand something more about the ancient Egyptian language. So when we look at the name Ptolemy on the Rosetta Stone, and from other sources, there's more than just his name there. We can see from our experience in this presentation that this is the name Ptolemy. Down here also, this is the name Ptolemy. But this part here, this is not the name Ptolemy. This is something else. And the question is, what is it? Well, this is a foreign name being spelled out in Egyptian hieroglyphs. But this part, this is Egyptian language written with Egyptian hieroglyphs. It's very different. If we separate out the parts that we don't recognize, and then we look at the translations which we have in Greek, in both cases, the Greek translation of these sections is the same. Ptolemy, ever living, beloved of Ptah. So we have this part, and also this part. Now Champollion knew from Coptic vocabularies that the old Egyptian word for life or living was Ankh, and that it was represented by the symbol Ankh. He therefore guessed that this part meant ever, and the PT in Ptah, which he had already worked out, can be easily identified. So the remaining symbol must be a kind of H sound, or something like it. This leaves only a few questions remaining. The last part of the Greek translation is beloved of Ptah. Champollion knew that the Coptic word love was mere. He assigned the value mer to the first case, and to the second he added an e, meri, mer, meri. Today, we were able to translate the Egyptian more accurately. So this is Ptolemus, Ptolemus, Ankh, Jet, Ptah, Meri, Ptolemy, ever living, beloved of Ptah. Now, in the beginning of our presentation, we saw this image. These three are gods. But this is a man. Who is he? Well, for 1,500 years, no one could answer that question. But once we learned how to read hieroglyphs, we could see that his name is right here. Right there. Can we read it? P, T, A, L, M, E, S, Ptolemus, Ptolemaios, Ankh, Jet, Ptah, Mer, Ptolemy, ever living, beloved of Ptah. Now, the problem that faced Champollion was that he was able to read only foreign names written in Egyptian. He wanted to be able to go back further, before the Greeks. He wanted to look at symbols that represented real Egyptian names. Now, at a certain point, Champollion was lucky in that he was able to receive a very highly detailed painting of this place. This place we call Abu Simbel, and it was built by a very important pharaoh. Now, as I have said, for 1,500 years, people looked at this, they wondered who this was, and they simply couldn't answer that question. Ironically, this pharaoh's name is written all over the site. We can see it here, 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 we can see it here. His name is everywhere. This whole thing was built with the idea that his name would be preserved. but unfortunately, people couldn't read it. But when Champollion received a copy of this, or a painting of this site, he noticed almost right away the name in the cartouche, right here. Now I'm going to show us an idealized form of this name, but we can see it. We can see a sun disk sitting on top of a god's head. This is the god of the sun. And we see this symbol here is a set of foxtails. And then we recognize this from earlier. This is a double S. And this over here is a title. So I'm going to eliminate the title and I'm going to simplify this hieroglyph, and we end up with this. And I put it in the direction of our reading. So we have this, this, and this. What name does that spell? Well, Champollion knew that these were S's, so whatever it is, it ends with S. He also knew that the Coptic word for sun was Re, so he assigns Ra for this one because it looks like the sun. And he had come across this symbol a number of times, and it always represented something to do with birth. And so the Coptic word for birth is mise, which is bear or bring forth life. And so he replaces this space in the middle with mis. And when he read this, he immediately recognized the name. This was the Egyptian pharaoh that he knew from the Bible. It turns out that this is not actually the same person that's in the Bible, but it's the same name that's in the Bible, and it is Ramses. Champollion jumped up from his work. He ran to his brother's office in the library, and he said, "I've got it." And then he fainted, and his family thought he had died. But when he came to, he explained what he had achieved. He had, for the first time in perhaps over 1,500 years, maybe even longer, he had actually read the name of an Egyptian pharaoh written in the Egyptian language. And today, if we look up Re in a Coptic dictionary, we can see that it comes from sun. And this is an example I gave at the very beginning of our presentation. This is R-A, Ra. R-A-Ra. Along with the sun disk, it is the word sun. And today when we transliterate it, we do it this way. This is Ra. Mise means bring forth, and we can see that mis is actually this symbol here, mis. Now let's take a look at an Egyptian sentence, a real Egyptian sentence. Egyptian is quite interesting in that the verb comes first in the sentence. We recognize this is sun, Ra. We can recognize these from earlier. This is pt, pet. This owl here is m. Turns out that this is a preposition. And so let's take a look and see what we have. This is weben, weben, Ra, pet. Weben means is rising or rises. Ra is the sun. Means in. And pt means sky, or pet means sky. So we have the sun is rising in the sky. Is rising, the sun, in the sky. Now this is an example sentence that we find in standard textbooks to get us started with being able to read Egyptian sentences, but let's take a look at one from an actual carving. This is an offering scene from the tomb of Sinbi at Meir, and it looks like this. Now we see a person here holding an ox leg. Now we would think, well, this must be a picture and this is actually the Egyptian, but in fact this is the first word of the inscription here. The Egyptians mixed artistic expression with their language very freely. And so we have a vocabulary list. This is down here. This is ma'acheru. This is the justified. This is a little bit like in our traditional funerary inscriptions. We have RIP, rest in peace, or requiescat in pace. This is ma'acheru, ma'acheru. Then we have hepesh. Hepesh is we see here the ox leg. Hepesh is the ox leg. And then we have en, ka, en. This is for the ka of. Ka is the soul, for the soul of. And then we have here sinbi. Sinbi, this is the name of the person. And then once again we have down here ma'acheru. So this is hepesh, en, ka, en, sinbi, ma'acheru. This foreleg of an ox is offered for the soul of Sinbi. May he rest in peace. This offering is for the ka of Sinbi, the justified. We hope you've enjoyed this presentation, and we hope we've interested you in this fantastic culture and this fantastic language. If you're interested to learn more, then you can enroll in a course in Middle Egyptian being offered here on campus starting in spring 2015. So if you'd like to learn more, then please enroll.